There was a new preacher who came to a large Baptist church in Kentucky, and he wanted to start his ministry off right, so he planned a 4-night revival. The first night, he preached on the evils of gambling, but a third of his congregation owned casinos, and they said, "Pastor, you can preach on whatever you want, but you just can't preach on that." So the second night, he preached on the evils of smoking. But this was Kentucky, and a third of his congregation made their living as tobacco farmers. And they said, "Pastor, you can preach on whatever you want, but you just can't preach on that." So the third night, he preached on the evils of drinking. But this was Kentucky, and a third of his congregation owned distilleries for making bourbon. And they said, "Pastor, you can preach on whatever you want. You just can't preach on that." So the pastor worked hard on that third night and came up with something he thought everyone would agree on. And the fourth night, he preached on the evils of fishing in someone else's territorial waters. And all the people said it was the best sermon that they had ever heard. I must confess I did not want to preach on this text today. I actually wanted to preach on Mark 7, where Jesus calls the Pharisees and scribes hypocrites and chastises them, saying, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God in order to keep your traditions." But a few weeks ago, I sent my materials to Laura and Amy for publication, and I accidentally typed Luke 7 instead of Mark 7. And then Luke 7 appeared in the news sheet, and I was sent out to the entire congregation. At first, I thought nobody reads the news sheet, so I can just preach on Mark 7 and no one will notice. But then I made the mistake of reading Luke 7. And I realized that my mistake wasn't an accident, but was the Holy Spirit trying to mess with me. This summer I've been preaching, those of you who've been here will know, on the relationship between the Bible and empire, Jesus and empire in the Gospel of Mark, Paul and empire in the letter to the Ephesians. But on the last Sunday of the summer and the last talk back of the year, God has decided to mess with me by daring me to preach on a text that seems to challenge, possibly even contradict, many of the things that I've said this summer. This is the problem with listening to God. It messes everything up. It's much easier to ignore these things. So what are we supposed to do with a story where a Roman centurion is the hero? How do we deal with a text where a man who pledged his life to defend the Roman Empire is praised by Jesus? Centurions, you will know, were commanders of at least 100 Roman soldiers, which means that they were the elite military men who pledged their lives to Caesar, and they were the ones who gave the orders to arrest and to kill and to oppress and to crucify. If you're wondering what Jewish people thought about them, scholar Richard Horsley states Roman soldiers terrorized people into submission through ruthlessly devastating the lands and the towns, slaughtering and enslaving the people, as well as crucifying dissenters along the roadways and public places to incite fear, submission, terror, and obedience. 5 years before Jesus was born, Judas, another Galilean, led a revolt against Rome, and the Roman general Varus responded by sending soldiers and centurions to crucify 2,000 Jewish rebels on the road from Sepphoris to Galilee. Sepphoris was only 3.5 miles, about an hour walk from where Jesus grew up. And every Jew in Galilee would have remembered the horrifying image of the bodies of their fathers and sons and uncles and cousins hanging on thousands of crosses along the roadside. The Jewish people despised Roman centurions for good reason. They were their brutal occupiers and oppressors. But then there's Luke 7, an inconvenient story in the grand narrative of imperial violence. A Roman centurion beloved by the Jewish people who amazes Jesus of Galilee so much he proclaimed, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." Faith. How could a Roman centurion have faith? Faith in what? Certainly not faith in a Jewish God or a Jew from Nazareth. What in the world did Jesus mean by faith? It can't mean what we usually mean when we talk about faith, can it? It can't be belief or assent to doctrine or dogma or miracle or mystery. It can't mean prayer or worship, because the centurion doesn't pray or bow down or lay prostrate or offer praise or even say thank you in this story. So what is faith then? Growing up as an evangelical, I was taught to memorize this verse in Hebrews 11. That is the definition of faith. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. Anybody else memorize that verse as a child? I see those hands. The only problem with that verse is that it's not very specific. Is faith the assurance of any kind of hope? All the things we hope for? Is faith the conviction of anything we cannot see? What kind of hopes and convictions did the centurion have? Weren't his convictions the convictions of a Roman soldier? Wasn't his hope the hope in the authority of Caesar and the glory of the empire? Centurions were agents of imperial power who held high political positions of status and military rank and social advantage and financial security. They were not only soldiers, but the security force and the police officers of their day. And with so much authority and power, they were in a prime position to abuse it, which, as historians note, happened often. How could anyone trust the hopes and convictions of a centurion or call it faith? But there was something different about this centurion. He was a man of peace. In fact, he had become friends with the enemy. This is the story of a worthy centurion. You might say a good centurion. You've heard the story of the Good Samaritan. A title like Good Samaritan, of course, implies that most Samaritans were bad, which is not true. It's a term that reflects ethnic stereotypes and religious bigotries of first-century Jews. Unlike Samaritans, however, centurions were actually, for the most part, bad dudes who oppressed people on behalf of the Roman state. Yet this centurion heard that Jesus was in Capernaum, and we are told he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of you to do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." Wow. Chew on that for a second. Jewish leaders came to Jesus on behalf of a Roman centurion. What kind of person do you have to be for the leaders of an oppressed people to advocate on your behalf, even though you work for and benefit from and represent the very empire and system that is oppressing them? You have to be really, really good. I was recently attending the funeral of a very powerful and well-heeled white person, and I was moved spiritually when an African-American leader stood up and spoke out about how much this powerful white man meant to his community, the black community. That's just not something you hear every day, is it? Likewise, our friends in the Jewish community have a title of honor that they bestow on Gentiles or non-Jews who risk their lives to help the Jewish people during things like the Holocaust or other atrocities. They call them righteous among the nations. The tension between Jewish soldiers and between the Roman soldiers and the Jewish community in the time of Jesus are similar to the tensions in our own society today between police and the black community. I heard a story last week about black residents of a local apartment complex who came together to fight against the property managers to fix the horrible living conditions that they were living in, when two Charlotte police officers who routinely patrol those apartments showed up at the meeting, and they said this: "We see the conditions that you're living in, and we support you in these efforts." And the residents stood up and gave them a round of applause. What do all these things have in common? They are examples of people with power being honored by those in a vulnerable position. They are witnesses of people with authority being called worthy by the disinherited and the oppressed. But in each case, it only happened because the people with power and authority broke protocol and risked themselves in some way for a people who were not their own. This is the story of the Good Centurion. Why did the leaders of the Jewish community advocate for him? Why did they consider him a person of honor? Why did they call him worthy? Because this Roman soldier, who was supposed to be their enemy, loved them and loved their people. And not just with his words. He put his money where his heart is, and his money where his mouth is, and he used the financial resources that he gained by working for the empire to build a synagogue for a religious community that he wasn't a part of, so they could practice a religion that he didn't believe in. Actions speak louder than words. Love is not a matter of what we feel. And faith is not determined by what we believe. Love and faith are always about what we do with the power and the resources God has given to us. The entire New Testament was written by Jewish people living as a minority population under imperial occupation. That is why the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche rejected Christianity for being a religion with a slave morality that celebrates weakness, emasculates humanity, and requires the transvaluation of all the noble ideals of Greek civilization. The problem with taking the context of the New Testament seriously as well-to-do American citizens is that we often are the Romans in the story. And I think the reason the Spirit challenged me to preach on this passage is that when you discover that the Gospels were written from the perspective of those with their backs against the wall, the logical question we ask ourselves is, what about people who don't have their backs against the wall? What about the rest of us? We hear about the marginalized and the oppressed, but what's in it for me? Is there hope for us? Is there grace for those with power and wealth? What is the good news for politicians and business leaders and lawyers and police officers and corporate executives and people of rank and position and social status, the middle class, the financially secure, the affluent, the well-endowed, the inherited? What is the good news for Myers Park, right? There is good news for us. The gospel is for us. Especially the Gospel of Luke, which I believe is uniquely concerned with the salvation of the rich and powerful. In Luke, Jesus mingles freely with the rich. He accepts invitations to banquets from wealthy and powerful people like the Pharisees and the rulers. His parables in Luke offer instruction to the wealthy. Some well-to-do women provide for his ministry out of their possessions and their resources. Jesus is not only praising the faith of Roman centurions, but helps the leader of a synagogue, Jairus, in an act of healing. A tax collector named Levi becomes his disciple. The chief tax collector of the entire region, Zacchaeus, repents and pays reparations to those that he defrauded. Jesus hangs out with the rich, but they always leave changed. In Mark and Matthew, the rich young ruler goes away in sadness, but in Luke, Jesus continues to talk to him. There's always hope and salvation for the rich and the powerful. The good news of grace that is offered to us there is a life of faith. But faith for the powerful always means acknowledging our power and learning how to use our power for the benefit of those who are less powerful. The story of the Roman centurion is my story. I was an American centurion, an army infantry officer, a soldier in command of other soldiers. If there's no salvation for the centurion, there's no salvation for me. His story is my story. And his story can be all of our stories. Instead of oppressing the Jewish people, he loved the Jewish people. Instead of destroying their synagogue, as some centurions would do later, he built their synagogue. Instead of presenting himself as powerful, authoritative, and worthy of honor, he humbled himself and considered himself unworthy of honor and sent his friends to Jesus on his behalf and put his own authority in deference to Jesus' authority. He submitted himself to one more powerful than the empire. And he never used his own power and resources for his own benefit, but only in this story for the benefit of others. He approached Jesus out of love for one of his servants, one who was ill and close to death. Scholars James Neal, Daniel Helminiak, as well as Theodore Jennings and Tat Seong Benny Liu form a consensus. All of these folks have written these different books, that the Greek words used in this text to describe the servant in this story has sexual and romantic connotations in the first century. So this servant may have in fact been the centurion's lover, which would explain his desperation. His heart was breaking, as all of our hearts do, when someone we love is sick or in pain or close to death. We would do anything it takes to relieve it, wouldn't we? No matter how rich or powerful we are, all of us have pain in our lives, and all of us are searching for healing. Sometimes the pain is in our hearts, our minds, our bodies. Other times, it's our hearts and minds and bodies of those that we love that cause us pain. Friends, family, parents, children, lovers, neighbors. Quite often our pain comes from suffering or the grief over the death of loss of another, or fear of the losing the people that we care about most deeply, or watching them suffer in front of us. Many times our pain is all-consuming. It can become so acute and blinding, we don't have the strength or the space to think about anything else. We can't watch the news or read the paper. We don't have the energy for anyone else's problems or the suffering of the oppressed or the pain of the world, because our own pain is so present with us, nothing else matters. Those are the times that we have to rest in the grace of what we've already done, to trust that whatever strength we can muster will be enough, and to rely on the love and support of our friends to carry us, to bear our burdens, to advocate for us, just as the Jewish leaders advocated for the centurion and his servant in their time of need. If we are human, we will all be wounded. And in some sense, our ability to be wounded is what makes us human. It's what we have in common with the rest of the human race. But like everything else in life, our pain can take us in different directions. Our pain can either close us off or it can open us up. We can let our pain close off our hearts and shut out the pain of the rest of the world, or we can allow our pain to open our hearts and make us more empathetic to the pain of others. Our personal wounds can reconnect us with the pain of others and remind us of our solidarity with the pain of the rest of the world. Wendell Berry once wrote in his book, The Hidden Wound, "None of us will ever be whole or dignified or free unless the people around us are whole, dignified, and free. And unless the whole world itself is free of contempt and misuse." That is what the Jewish leaders in Capernaum can teach us. They knew the centurion's pain was their own pain, and the centurion's healing was their own healing, just as the centurion knew the servant's pain was his own pain, and the servant's healing was bound up with his own. Healing in this story and in the story of our lives is usually found in the power and the grace of community. Jesus was amazed by the centurion's faith, and so are we. But Jesus wasn't the one who offered healing here. Look at the text. He never met the centurion face to face. He never touched or spoke with the centurion's servant. In fact, even more astonishing, Jesus never even said anything about healing. There is no get up and walk, or take your mat and walk, or go, your faith has made you well. None of those proclamations. It's as if Jesus wasn't responsible for this miracle. All we know is he's amazed by the centurion's faith. And Luke tells us that when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Could it be that the faith of the good centurion was powerful enough to heal his own servant? If so, you've heard of amazing grace. Well, that is amazing faith. That is what it looks like for people in positions of power to be worthy, to be good, to have faith. It means advocating for the health and well-being of those we love, but also loving the oppressed, treating the poor with honor, and offering our resources to build their communities. Faith is not just the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. It is trust and loyalty to God embodied in acts of love, generosity, selflessness, and humility toward those most vulnerable. The amazing faith of the good centurion is a faith that recognizes there will always be a power and authority in this world that is far greater than our own. A power that is far more powerful than any of the empires that the world has ever seen. A power that is far more eternal than Rome or America. And that is the power of a God who never leaves us or forsakes us. A God who has a preferential option for the poor and yet desperately loves the rich and the powerful as well. A God who is seeking the salvation of all people. And so as Americans in positions of privilege and power, as people with pain in our lives and lovers in need of healing, we don't have to wonder if there is grace or good news for us. This is the gospel. This is the good news for us. That no matter how rich or powerful we are, we have been given the opportunity for liberation as well through the gift of an amazing faith, a faith that is available even to Roman oppressors, a faith found anywhere that people are willing to live a life of love, generosity, selflessness, and humility. That is true faith. And this faith can be ours if we want it, and we should claim it. Because whenever we embody it together and bear it with one another in community, this faith not only has the power to heal those that we love, it also has the power to heal the world. Amen.